So what are semiconductors? And this is really important to talk about because semiconductors have been one of the best performing industries slash sectors in the overall market. So semiconductors are basically anything that has the properties of conductivity. So it essentially allows an electronic current, and they're used in almost any sort of electronic that you can think of, whether it's the iPhone or the iPad or a computer.
Here I have a circuit with a battery, light bulb, and gap. If I fill this gap with a metal, the light comes on. If I fill this gap with glass, the light stays off. You probably already know this because metal is an electric conductor and glass is an insulator. But what happens when I fill this gap with a silicon wafer? The light stays off, so you might think the silicon's an insulator. But what if I heat it up? Thank you. It lights up. The silicon is insulating at room temperature but conducts electricity when it's very hot. It's a semiconductor whose conductivity changes based on the environment. This special ability makes semiconductors the perfect brains for electronic devices. Circuits of small semiconductor switches, called transistors, are at the heart of computer chips and enable them to do math and run programs. Semiconductors have enabled electronics to become smaller, faster, and more reliable. But what is it exactly about these semiconductors that allow them to either conduct or insulate? In a single atom, electrons can occupy specific energy levels. When multiple atoms bond, the electrons are shared between them. But because the atoms are now interacting, the energy levels shift around. In a solid, trillions and trillions of atoms interact with each other. Their individual energy levels smear into energy bands. For a material to conduct, the electrons must be able to jump from lower energy states to higher ones. The spacing of these energy levels and how they're filled with electrons determines if the material is a conductor, insulator, or semiconductor. If there's a huge gap between the lower energy levels and the higher ones, it's hard for electrons to jump to the higher ones, so current can't flow, and it's an insulator like this glass. Metals have no gap at all. Electrons can move to the higher energy levels with no problem. Current can flow. Semiconductors fall somewhere in the middle. They have a medium-sized band gap. So technically, I can make this glass conduct electricity if I added enough energy through heat to push the electrons into a higher band. But that amount of heat would either melt or break the glass before it actually conducts. This is true of most insulators. The amount of energy needed to make them conduct is just too high. But in a semiconductor, the band gap is small enough that electrons can jump into the higher energy band so that current can flow. The amount of heat we apply determines how many electrons jump into the higher band and how much current flows. And heat isn't the only way to change the conductivity in a semiconductor. We can also use light, electric currents, and in a computer, electric fields. As I've said, computers are made up of semiconductor switches called transistors that switch between conducting and insulating. Computers use electric fields because heat is slow and would burn too much energy. We can turn this wafer into a computer chip by printing a circuit of transistors on it using a process called photolithography. Here, in the photo room, we cover the wafer with a light-sensitive material and expose it to light that we shine through a patterned mask. Then, we develop the wafer, like film and photography, which leaves behind a pattern that becomes the circuit. Printing the transistors at once lets you make circuits that are smaller and cheaper than if you built them from individual parts. Transistors make up the logic elements, the memory components, and the communication modules that let computers talk to each other. With semiconductors, you can cheaply add transistors to almost any device you can think of, from spaceships to servers to maybe even your toaster. Semiconductors have enabled the technological revolution, the internet, the computer, and the cell phone. No semiconductors, no information age.
And so semiconductors are really important. They're at the foundation of all electronic products. Some of the main companies that you should think of whenever you think of semiconductors are Intel or AMD or NVIDIA. And these are some of the main ones, but there are all sorts of other smaller companies. So semiconductors have done really well because technology and in general, like computers and all these other things are some of the best performing areas of the market, and they have been for the last however many years. And so as the pace of technology continually increases in electronic devices, semiconductors do really well. Now, in the last year or so, there's been this really rapid change in the pace of growth of the semiconductor industry. One of the reasons why is because now we're seeing new industries that are being born, like artificial intelligence, or robotics. Some of the robotics that are being utilized in different companies are getting really advanced, and it's requiring a lot more semiconductor power and a lot more sophisticated sort of infrastructure, I guess you could say, with these semiconductors. So companies like NVIDIA, they're working on self-driving technology. They're building these semiconductors for self-driving cars. And the self-driving car industry is one that's really been the pace of growth has really taken off pretty dramatically. It's brand new, and so as this industry starts to grow and as we start to see more changes that happen in the market, these semiconductor companies are going to do well as a result of that. Artificial intelligence, same thing. Just in general, artificial intelligence requires a shit ton of semiconductor power and overall this chip processing power. And so semiconductors are doing really well as a result of that. Now, one of the things, a lot of people think it's a bubble. A lot of people think that the pace of growth has been sort of overestimated. Now, that's something I'm not 100% sure on. It really depends on how quickly self-driving technology for these different cars, how quickly that grows, how quickly artificial intelligence and all these other areas of the market grow. But the expectations, one of the things you need to look at is the estimates. What are the estimates? What are the growth estimates over the next 10 years of self-driving cars, artificial intelligence? How big are these industries going to be? How big a percentage of that industry are certain companies are they going to actually take? And which companies are going to benefit the most? So right now, one of the companies that stands out is NVIDIA. I think that's one of the ones that stands out for almost anybody who's been paying attention because it's performed extremely well compared to a lot of the other semiconductor companies out there. Why? Because they've been developing technology in a much more sophisticated way than their competitors. They've gotten a lot of contracts. They've gotten a lot of, they've really been investing the most amount as far as research and development into some of these products that they need. So therefore, they've benefited the most. They probably will continue to benefit a lot in the future. So that's one of the trends that we're paying a lot of attention to. We'll talk more about this. This is sort of just an introduction to semiconductors, understanding that overall industry sector. We'll talk about some of the characteristics. We'll talk about, just generally speaking, how broad this sector can be. So anyways, guys, let's continue on.